Yes, I'm live. It's good. Hello, everybody. How's it going? That went very, very smoothly, going live straight onto YouTube. So right now, I'm just positioning my microphone so it's nice and below my face. All right. I did a new shave today, so hopefully the new book goes well with the new shave and the new shirt. Yeah, so I think we're going to go live from YouTube for a little bit now instead of from Facebook. And I think I can see the live YouTube chat. Straightforward, very nice, like it. So let me know when you're here. Give me a wave, give me a like, and in order to, I'm a little early, so I'll give it 45 seconds to see anybody coming in live and hot. Yeah. Okay, so seems like my microphone is a little bit light. Ugh, that's unfortunate. Oops, there's mute. Share, that's a cool feature. All right. See one person. Participants. Can I see participants? No. Pop out chat, toggle, timestamp. On. Okay. All right, cool. Very first live chat on Facebook. Nope. This is YouTube this time. So I'm about to start reading a new book from the London Journal. Oops. Oh, I messed that up again. This time we've walked ahead a year to 1863. 157 years ago. We're going to be reading from the London Journal. We're going to be reading along with the publications this time so that it goes step by step with each installment that the literature was broken. And this time I will be reading Lady Audley's Secret. And this time it's by the author of Aurora Floyd. And I thought that the actual author was posted on this page, but I missed it. So I'll get the author posted as well soon. Okay. There we go. That'll be great. All right. So here we go. Hobey ho. Let's go. It lay down in a hollow, rich with fine old timber and luxuriant pastures, and you came upon it through an avenue of limes bordered by either side by meadows, over the high hedges of which the cattle looked inquisitively at you as you passed, wondering, perhaps, what you wanted, for there was no thoroughfare, and unless you were going to the court, you had no business there at all. At the end of this avenue there was an old arch and clock tower and a stupid, bewildering clock, which only had one hand and which jumped straight from one hour to the next and was therefore always in extremes. Through this arch you walked straight into the gardens of Audley Court. A smooth lawn lay before you, dotted with groups of rhododendrons, which grew in more perfection here than anywhere else in the country. To the right there were the kitchen gardens, the fish pond, and an orchard bordered by a dry moat, and a broken ruin of a wall, in some places thicker than it was high, and everywhere overgrown with trailing ivy, yellow stonecrop, and dark moss. To the left there was a broad, gravelled walk, down which years ago, when the place had been a convent, the quiet nuns had walked hand in hand, a wall bordered with espaliers, and shadowed on one side by goodly oaks, which shut out the flat landscape, and circled in the house and gardens with a darkening shelter. The house faced the arch and occupied 3 sides of a quadrangle. It was very old and very irregular and rambling, The windows were uneven, and some small, some large, some with heavy stone mullions and rich stained glass, others with frail lattices that rattled in every breeze, others so modern that they might have been added only yesterday. Great piles of chimneys rose up here and there behind the pointed gables, and seemed as if they were so broken down by age and long service that they must have fallen but for the staggering ivy which, crawling up the walls and trailing ever over the roof, wound itself around them and supported them. The principal door was squeezed into a corner of a turret, as one angle of the building, as if it was hiding dangerous visitors and wished to keep itself a secret. A noble door for all that, old oak and studded with great square-headed iron nails, and so thick that the sharp iron knocker struck upon it with a muffled sound, and the visitor rang a clanging bell that dangled in a corner amongst the ivy, lest the noise of the knocking should never penetrate the stronghold. A glorious old place, a place that visitors fell into raptures with, feeling a yearning to wish to have done with life, and stay there forever, starving into the cool fish ponds, staring into the cool fish ponds and counting the bubbles as the roach and carp rose to the surface of the water, a spot in which peace seemed to have taken up her abode, setting her soothing hand on every tree and flower in the still ponds and quiet alleys, the shadowy corners of the old-fashioned rooms, the deep window seats behind the painted glass, and low meadows and the stately avenues, even upon the stagnant well, which, cool and sheltered as all else in the old place, hid itself away in a shrubbery behind the gardens, and with an idle hand that was never turned, and a lazy rope so rotten that the pail had broken away from it and had fallen into the water. A noble place inside a well as out, a noble place, a house in which you inconscientiously lost yourself if ever you were so rash as to go about it alone, a house in which no one room had any sympathy with another, every chamber running off at a tangent into an inner chamber, and through that down some narrow staircase leading to a door, which in its turn led back into that very part of the house from which you thought yourself the farthest. A house that could never have been planned by any mortal architect, but must have been the handiwork of that good old builder Time, who, adding a room one year and knocking down a room another, toppling over now a chimney covel with the planter garnets, and setting up one in style of the Tudors, shaking down a bit of Saxon wall there, and allowing a Norman arch to stand here, throwing in a row of high, narrow windows in the reign of Queen Anne, and joining on a dining room after the fashion of the time of Hanoverian George I, to a refectory that had been standing since the Conquest, and contrived in some 11 centuries to run up such a mansion as was not elsewhere to be met with throughout the country of Essex. Of course, in such a house there were secret chambers. The little daughter of the present owner, Sir Michael Audley, had fallen by accident upon the discovery of one. A board had rattled under her feet in the great nursery where she played, and on attention being drawn to it, it was found to be loose, and so removed, revealing a ladder leading to a hidden place between the floor of the nursery and the ceiling of the room below, a hiding place so small that he who hid there must have crouched on his hands and knees, or lain at full length, and yet large enough to contain a quaint, old, carved oak chest, half filled with priests' vestments, which had been hidden away, no doubt, in those cruel days when the life of a man was in danger, if he was discovered to have harbored a Roman Catholic priest, or to have had mass said in his house. The broad outer moat was dry and grass-grown, and laden trees of orchard hung over it, with gnarled, strangling branches that drew fantastical patterns upon the green slope, Within this moat there was, I have said, the fish pond, a sheet of water that extended the whole length of the garden, and bordering which there was an avenue called the Lime Tree Walk, an avenue so shaded with the sun and the sky, so screened from observation by the thick shelter of the overarching trees that it seemed a chosen place for secret meetings, or for stolen interviews, a place in which a conspiracy might have been planned, or a lover's vow registered with equal safety, and yet it was scarcely 20 paces from the house. At the end of this dark arcade there was a shrubbery, where, half buried amongst the tangled branches and the neglected weeds, stood the rusty wheel of that old well of which we have spoken. It had been of good service in its time, no doubt, and busy nuns have perhaps drawn the cool water with their own hands, but it had fallen with disuse now, and scarcely anyone in Audley Court knew where the springs had dried up or not. But sheltered as was the solitude of this lime tree walk, I doubt very much if it was ever put any romantic uses. Often in the cool of the evening Sir Michael Audley would stroll up and down smoking his cigar, with his dog at his heels and his pretty young wife dawdling by his side. But in about 10 minutes the baronet and his companions would grow tired of the rustling limes and the still water hidden under the spreading leaves of the water lilies, and the long green vista with the broken well at the end would stroll back to the white drawing-room where my lady played dreamily melodies by Beethoven and Mundelssohn till her husband fell asleep in his easy-chair. Sir Michael Audley was 56 years of age, and he had married a second wife 3 months after his 55th birthday. He was a big man, tall and stout, with a deep, sonorous voice, handsome black eyes, and a white beard which made him look venerable against his will, for he was active as a boy and one of the hardiest riders in the country. For 17 years he had been a widower, with an only child, a daughter, Alicia Audley, now 18, and by no means too well pleased at having a stepmother brought home to the court. For Miss Alicia had reigned supreme in her father's house since her eldest childhood. Of her earliest childhood, and had carried the keys and jingled them in the pockets of her silk aprons, and lost them in the shrubbery, and dropped them into the pond, and given all manner of trouble about them from the hour in which she entered her teens, and bad on that account deluded herself into the sincere belief that for the whole of that period she had been keeping house. But Miss Alicia's day was over, and now when she asked anything of the housekeeper would tell her that she would speak to my lady, and if my lady pleased it should be done. So the baronet's daughter, who was an excellent horsewoman and a very clever artist, spent most of her time out of doors, riding about the green lanes and sketching the cottage children, and the ploughboys and the cattle, and all manner of animal life that came in her way. She met her face with a sulky determination against any intimacy between herself and the baronet's young wife. And miserable as that lady was, she found it quite impossible to overcome Miss Alicia's prejudice and dislike, or to convenience the spoilt girl that she had not done her a cruel injury in marrying Sir Michael Audley. The truth was, Lady Audley had, in becoming the wife of Sir Michael, made one of those apparently advantageous matches which are apt to draw upon a woman the envy and hatred of her sex. She had come into the neighborhood as a governess in the family of a surgeon in the village near Audley Court. No one knew anything of her except that she came in answer to an advertisement which Mr. Dawson, the surgeon, had inserted in the Times. She came from London, and the only reference she gave was to a lady at a school at Brompton, where she had once been a teacher. I'm doing my live video. Okay. But this reference was so satisfactory that none other was needed, and Miss Lucy Graham was received by the surgeon as the instructress of his daughters. Her accomplishments were so brilliant and numerous that it seemed strange that she should have answered an advertisement offering such very moderate terms of remuneration as those named by Mr. Dawson. But Miss Graham seemed perfectly well satisfied with her situation, and she taught the girls to play sonnets by Beethoven and to paint from nature after Creswick, and walked through the dull, out-of-the-way village to the humble little church 3 times on Sunday, as contentedly as if she had no higher aspiration in the world than to do so all the rest of her life. People who deserved this accounted for it by saying that it was part of her amiable and gentle nature always to be light-hearted, happy, and contented under any circumstances. Wherever she went, Wherever she went, she seemed to take joy and brightness with her. In the cottages of the poor, her fair face shone like a sunbeam. She would sit for a quarter of an hour talking with some old woman, and apparently was pleased with the admiration of a toothless crone, as if she had been listening to the compliments of a marquis. And when she tripped away, leaving nothing behind her, for her poor salary gave no scope to her benevolence, the old woman would burst out into smile raptures with her grace, her beauty, and her kindness, such as she never bestowed upon the vicar's wife, who had half fed and clothed her. For you see, Miss Lucy Graham was blessed with that magic power of fascination by which a woman can charm with a word or intoxicate with a smile. Everyone loved, admired, and praised her. The boy who opened the 5-barred gate that stood in her pathway ran home to his mother to tell of her pretty looks and the sweet voice in which she thanked him for the little service. The verger at the church who ushered her into the surgeon's pew, the vicar who sat, the soft blue eyes uplifted to his face as he preached his simple sermon, the porter from the railway station who brought her sometimes and bet a letter or a parcel, and who never looked for reward from her. Her employers, her visitors, her pupils, her servants, everybody high and low, united in celebrating that Lucy Graham was the sweetest girl that ever lived. Perhaps it was this cry which penetrated into the quiet chambers of Audley Court, or perhaps it was the look of her face, looking over the surgeon's very pew every Sunday morning. However it was certain that Sir Michael Audley suddenly experienced a strong desire to be better acquainted with Mr. Dawson's governess. He had only to hint this to the worthy doctor for a little party to be set up, to which the vicar and his wife and the baronet and his daughter were invited. That one quiet evening scaled Miss Sir Michael's fate. Sealed. Some of this document is half inked. That one quiet evening sealed Sir Michael's fate. He could no more resist the tender fascinations of those soft and melting blue eyes, the graceful beauty of that slender throat and drooping head, with its wealth of showering flaxen curls, the low must of that gentle voice. This one's gone. The low noise of that gentle voice, the perfect harmony which pervaded every charm and made all doubly charming to this woman. Then he could hoist his destiny. Then he could resist his destiny. Destiny! Why, she was his destiny. He had never loved before. What had been his marriage with Alicia's mother but a dull and forgotten bargain made to keep some estate in the family that would have been just as well out of it. What had been his love for the first wife but a poor, pitiful, smouldering spark, too dull to be extinguished, too feeble to burn? But this was love, this fever, this longing, this restlessness, uncertain, miserable hesitation, these cruel fears that his age was an insurmountable barrier to his happiness, this sick hatred of his white beard, this frenzied wish to be young again, with glistening raven hair, with a slim waist such as he had 20 years before. These wakeful nights and melancholy days so gloriously brightened. If he chanced to catch a glimpse of her sweet face behind the window curtains as he drove past the surgeon's house, all these signs gave token of the truth, and told only too plainly that, at the sober age of 55, Sir Michael Audley had fallen ill of the terrible fever called love. I do not think that throughout this courtship the baronet once calculated upon his wealth or his position as a strong reason for his success. If he ever remembered those things, he dismissed the thought of them with a shudder. It pained him too much to believe for a moment that anyone so lovely and innocent could value herself against a splendid house or a good old title. No, his hope was that, as her life had been most likely one of toil and dependence, and as she was very young, nobody exactly knew her age, but so looked little more than 20, she thought might never have formed any attachment, and that he, being the first to woo her, might be tender attentions by generous watchfulness, by a love which should recall to her the father she had lost, and by a protecting care that should make him necessary to her, win her young heart, and obtain from her fresh and earliest love alone the promise of her hand. It was a very romantic daydream, no doubt, but for all that, it seemed a very fair way to be realized. Lucy Graham appeared by no means to dislike the baronet's attentions. There was nothing whatever in her manner of the shallow artifice employed by a woman who wishes to captivate a rich man. She was so used to admiration from everyone, high and low, that Sir Michael's conduct made very little impression upon her. Again, he had been so many years a widower that people had given up the idea of his ever marrying again. At last, however, Miss Dawson spoke to the governess on the subject. The surgeon's wife was sitting in the schoolroom busy at work, while Lucy was putting the finishing touches on some watercoloured sketches done by her pupils. "Do you know how, my dear Miss Graham?" "Do you know, my dear Miss Graham," said Miss Dawson, "I think you ought to consider yourself a remarkably lucky girl." The governess lifted her head from its stooping attitude and stared wonderingly at her employer, shaking back a shower of curls. They were the most wonderful curls in the world, soft and feathery, always floating away from her face and making a pale halo round her head when the sunlight shone through them. "What do you mean, my dear Miss Dawson?" she asked, dipping her camel's hair brush into the wet aquamarine upon the palette, and poising it carefully before putting it in the delicate streak of purple which was to brighten the horizon in her pupil's sketch. "Why, I mean, my dear, that it only rests with yourself to become Lady Audley, and the mistress of Audley Court." Lucy Graham dropped the brush upon the picture, and flushed scarlet to the roots of her fair hair, and they grew pale again, far paler than Miss Dawson had ever seen her before. "My dear, don't agitate yourself," said the surgeon's wife soothingly. "You know that nobody asks you to marry Sir Michael unless you wish. Of course it would be a magnificent match. He has a splendid income and is one of the most generous men. Your position would be very high, and you would be enabled to do a great deal of good. But as I said before, you must be entirely guided by your own feelings. Only one thing I must say, and that is that if Sir Michael's attentions are not agreeable to you, it is really scarcely onerous to encourage him." "His attention? Encourage him?" muttered Lucy, as if the words bewildered her. Pray don't talk to me, Miss Dawson. I have no idea of this. It is the last thing that would have occurred to me." She leaned her elbows on the drawing board before her and, collapsing her hands over her face, seemed for some minutes to be thinking deeply. She wore a narrow black ribbon round her neck with a locket, or a cross, or a miniature perhaps attached to it. But whatever that trinket was, she always kept it hidden under her dress. Once or twice, while she sat silently thinking, she removed one of her hands from her face and fidgeted nervously with the ribbon, clutching at it with a half-angry gesture and twisting it backwards and forwards between her fingers. "I think some people are born to be unlucky, Miss Dawson," she said by and by. "It would be a great deal too much good fortune for me to become Lady Audley." She said this with so much bitterness in her tone that the surgeon's wife looked at her with surprise. "You unlucky, my dear," she exclaimed. "I think you're the last person who ought to talk like that. You, such a bright, happy creature that it does everyone good to see you. I'm sure I don't know what we shall do if Sir Michael robs us of you." After this conversation, they often spoke upon the subject, and Lucy never again showed any emotion whatever when the baronet's admiration for her was canvassed. It was a tacitly understood thing in the surgeon's family that whenever Sir Michael proposed, the governess would quietly accept him, and indeed the simple Dawsons would have thought it something more than madness in a penniless girl to reject such an offer. So one misty June evening, Sir Michael, sitting opposite to Lucy Graham at a window in the surgeon's little drawing-room, took an opportunity, while the family happened to by some accident be absent from the room, of speaking upon the subject nearest to his heart. He made the governess, in a few but solemn words, an offer of his hand. There was something almost touching in the manner and tone in which he spoke to her, half in depreciation, knowing that he could hardly expect to be the choice of a beautiful young girl, and praying rather that she would reject him, even though she broke his heart by doing so. Then she should accept his offer if she did not love him. "I scarcely think there is a greater sin." "I scarcely think there is a greater sin, Lucy," he said solemnly, "than that of a woman who marries a man she does not love. You are so precious to me, my beloved, that deeply as my heart is set on this, and bitter as the mere thought of disappointment is to me, I would not have you commit such a sin for any happiness of mine. If my happiness could be achieved by such an act, which it could not, which it never could," he repeated earnestly, "nothing but misery could result from a marriage dictated by any motive but truth and love." Lucy Graham was not looking at Sir Michael, but straight out into the misty twilight and the dim landscape far away beyond the little garden. The baronet tried to see her face, but her profile was turned to him, and he could not discover the expression of her eyes. If he could have done so, he would have seen a yearning gaze, which seemed as if it would have pierced the far obscurity and looked away into another world. "Lucy, you heard me?" "Yes," she said, gravely, not coldly or in any way as if she was offended at his words. "And your answer?" She did not remove her gaze from the darkening countryside, but for some moments was quite silent. Then turning to him with a sudden passion in her manner that lighted up her face with a new and wonderful beauty, which the baronet perceived even in the growing twilight, she fell on her knees at his feet. No, Lucy, no, he cried vehemently. "Not here, not here!" "Not here? Yes, here, she said, The strange passion which agitated her, making her voice sound shrill and piercing, not loud, but preternaturally distinct.
Here and nowhere else. How good you are, how noble, and how generous. Love you. Why, there was woman 100 times my superior in beauty and in goodness. Who might love you dearly. But you ask too much of me, you ask too much of me. Remember what my life has been. Only remember that. From my very babyhood, I have never seen anything but poverty. My father was a gentleman, clever, accomplished, generous, handsome, but poor. My mother, but do not let me speak of her. Poverty, trials, vexations, humiliations, deprivations, you cannot tell. You who are amongst those for whom life is so smooth and easy, you can never guess what is endured by such as we. Do not ask too much of me, then. I cannot be disinterested. I cannot be blind to the advantages of such an alliance. I cannot.
Beyond her agitation and her passionate vehemence, there was an undefined something in her manner which filled the baronet with a vague alarm. She was still on the ground at his feet, crouching rather than kneeling, her thin white dress clinging about her, her pale hair streaming over her shoulders, her great blue eyes glittering in the dusk, and her hands clutching at the black ribbon about her throat, as if it had been strangling her.
Don't ask too much of me,
she kept repeating.
I have been selfish from my babyhood.
Lucy, speak plainly. Do you dislike me?
Dislike you? No.
But is there anyone else whom you love?
She laughed aloud at the question.
I do not love anyone in the world, she answered.
He was glad of her reply, and yet that and the strange laugh jarred upon his feelings. He was silent for some moments, and then said, with a kind of effort,
Well, Lucy, I will not ask too much of you. I dare say I am a romantic old fool. But if you do not dislike me, and if you do not love anyone else, I see no reason why we should not make a very happy couple. Is it a bargain, Lucy?
Yes.
The baronet lifted her in his arms and kissed her upon the forehead. Then, after quietly bidding her good night, he walked straight out of the house. This foolish old man, because there was some strange emotion at work in his heart. Neither joy nor triumph, but something almost akin to disappointment. Some stiffened and unsatisfied longing which lay heavy and dull at his heart, as if he had carried a corpse in his bosom. He carried the corpse of that hope which had died at the sound of Lucy's words. All the doubts and fears and timid aspirations were ended now. He must be contented, like other men of his age, to be married for his fortune and his position. Lady Graham went slowly up the stairs to her little room at the top of the house. She placed a dim candle on the chest of drawers and seated herself on the edge of the white bed, still and white as the draperies hanging around her.
No more dependence, no more drudgery, no more humiliations, she said. Every trace of the old life melted away, every clue to identity buried and forgotten, except these.
She had never taken off her hand from the black ribbons at her throat. She drew it from her bosom as she spoke and looked at the object attached to it. It was neither a locket, a miniature, nor a cross. It was a ring, wrapped in an oblong piece of paper. The paper partly printed, partly written, yellowed with age, and crumpled with much folding. Chapter 2. on board the Argus. He threw the end of his cigar into the water, and leaning his elbows upon the bulwarks, stared meditatively at the waves.
"How wearisome they are," he said. "Blue and green and opal. Opal and blue and green. All very well in their way, of course, but 3 months of them are rather too much, especially."
He did not attempt to finish his sentence. His thoughts seemed to wander in the very midst of it and carry him to 1,000 miles or so away.
"Poor little girl. How pleased she'll be," he muttered,
opening his cigar case and lazily surveying its contents.
"How pleased and how surprised. Poor little girl.
After 3 years and a half, too, she will be surprised. He was a young man of about 25, with a dark face bronzed of exposure to the sun. He had handsome brown eyes with a feminine smile in them that sparkled through the black lashes, and a bushy beard and mustache that covered the whole of the lower part of his face. He was tall and powerfully built. He wore a loose grey suit and felt hat, thrown carelessly upon his black hair. His name was George Talbys, and he was aft cabin passenger on board the good ship Argus, laden with Australian wool and sailing from Sydney to Liverpool. There were very few passengers in the aft cabin of the Argus. An elderly wool stapler, returning to his native country, and his wife and daughters, after having made a fortune in the colonies. A governess of 35 years of age, going home to marry a man whom she had been engaged 15 years. The sentimental daughter of a wealthy Australian wine merchant invoiced to England to flourish her education, and George Talbys were the only first-class passengers on board. This George Talbys was the life and soul of the vessel. Nobody knew who or what he was, or where he came from, but everybody liked him. He sat at the bottom of the dinner table and assisted the captain in doing the honours of the friendly meal. He opened the champagne bottles and took wine with everyone present, and told funny stories and led the laugh himself with such a joyous peal that the man must have been a churl who could not have laughed for pure sympathy. He was a capital hand at speculation in vignetton, and all the merry round games which kept the little circle round the cabin lamp so deep in innocent amusement that a hurricane might have howled overhead without their hearing it. But he freely owned that he had no talent for whist, and that he could not distinguish a knight from a castle upon the chessboard. Indeed, Mr. Talbys was by no means too learned a gentleman. The pale governess had tried to talk to him about fashionable literature, but George had only pulled his beard and stared very hard at her, saying occasionally,
Yes, and to be sure."
The sentimental young lady going home to finish her education had tried him with Shelley and Byron, and had been fairly laughed in her face, as if poetry were a joke. The wool stapler sounded upon him politics, but he did not seem very deeply versed in them. So they let him go his own way, smoked his cigars and talked to the sailors, lounge over the bulwarks and stare at the water, and make himself agreeable to everybody in his own fashion. But when the Argus came to be within a fortnight's sail of England, everybody noticed a change in George Talbys. He grew restless and fidgety, and sometimes so merry that the cabin rang with his laughter, sometimes moody and thoughtful. Favourite as he was amongst the sailors, they grew tired at last of answering his perpetual questions about the probable time of touching land. Would it be in 10 days, in 11, in 12, in 13? Was the wind favourable? How many knots an hour was the vessel doing? Then a sudden passion would seize him, and he would stamp upon deck, crying out that she was a rickety old craft, and that the other owners were swindlers to advertise her as the fast-sailing Argus. She was not fit for passenger traffic, She was not fit to carry impatient living creatures with hearts and souls. She was fit for nothing but to be laden with the bales of stupid wool that might rot in the sea and be none the worse for it. The sun was dropping down behind the waves as George Talby's lighted his cigar upon the August evening. Only 10 days more, the sails had told him, that afternoon, and they would see the English coast.
"I will go ashore the first boat that hails us,"
he cried.
"I will go ashore in a cockle shell. By Jove, if it comes to that, I will swim to land."
His friends in the aft cabin, and with the exception of the pale governess, laughed at his impatience. She sighed as she watched the young man chafing at the slow hours, pushing away his untasted wine, flinging himself restlessly about the cabin sofa, rushing up and down the champion ladder, and staring at the waves. As the red rim of the sun dropped into the water, the governess ascended to the cabin stairs for a stroll on the deck, while the passengers sat over their wine below. She stopped when she came up to George, and standing by his side, watching the fading crimson in the western sky. The lady was very quiet and reserved, seldom sharing in her after cabin amusements, never laughing and speaking very little, but she and George Talby's had been excellent friends throughout the passage.
Does my cigar annoy you, Miss Morley?" he said, taking it out of his mouth.
Not at all. Pray do not leave of smoking. I only came up to look at the sunset. What a lovely evening."
Yes, I dare say," he answered impatiently. "Yet so long, 10 more interminable days and 10 more weary nights before we land."
"Yes," said Miss Morley, sighing. "Do you wish the time shorter?"
"Do I?"
cried George.
"Indeed I do, don't you?"
"Scarcely."
"But is there no one you love in England? Is there no one you love looking out for your arrival?"
"I hope so,"
she said gravely. They were silent for some time, he smoking his cigar with a furious impatience, as if he could hasten the course of the vessel by his own restlessness. She looking out at the waning light with melancholy blue eyes that seemed to have faded with poring over closely printed books and difficult needlework, eyes that had faded a little perhaps by reason of tears secretly shed in the dead hours of the lonely night.
"See,"
said George suddenly, pointing in another direction from towards which Miss Morley was looking.
"There's the new moon."
She looked up at the pale crescent, her own face almost pale and wan.
"This is the first time we've seen it. We must wish," said George. "I know what I wish."
"What?"
"That we may get home quickly."
"My wish is that we may find no disappointment when we get there,"
said the governess sadly.
"Disappointment?"
He started as if he had been struck, and asked what she meant by talking of disappointment.
"I mean this,"
she said, speaking rapidly and with a restless motion of her thin hands.
"I mean that at no end of this long voyage draws near. Hope sinks in my heart, and a sick fear comes over me that at the last all may not be well. The person to whom I go to meet may be changed in his feeling towards me, or may be certain of the old feeling until the moment of seeing me, and then lose it in a breath at sight of my poor wan face. For I was called a pretty girl, Mr. Talboys, when I sailed for Sydney 15 years ago. And he may be so changed by the world as to have grown selfish and mercenary, and he may welcome me for the sake of my 15 years' savings. Again, he may be dead. He may have been well, perhaps, up to within a week of our landing, and in that last week may have been taken by a fever, and died an hour before our vessel anchors in the Mersey. I think of all these things, Mr. Talboys, and act the scenes over in my mind, and feel the anguish of them 20 times a day. 20 times a day, she repeated. Why, I do it 1,000 times a day.
George Talbys had stood, motionless with his cigar in his hand, listening to her, so intently that as the last words were said, his hold relaxed and the cigar dropped into the water.
I wonder,
She continued more to herself than to him.
I wonder, looking back, to think how hopeful I was when the vessel sailed. I never thought then of disappointment, but I pictured the joy of meeting, imagining the very words that would be said, the very tones, the very looks. But for this last month of the voyage, day by day and hour by hour, my heart sinks, and my hopeful fancies fade away, and I dread the end as much as if I knew that I was going to England to attend a funeral.
The young man suddenly changed his attitude and turned his face full upon his companion with a look of alarm. She saw in the pale light that the colour had faded from his cheek.
What a fool!
He cried, striking his clenched fist upon the side of the vessel.
What a fool I am to be frightened at this! Why do you come and say these things to me? Why do you come and terrify me out of my senses when I am going straight home to the woman I love, to a girl whose heart is so true as the light of heaven, and in whom I no more expect to find any change than I do see another sunrise in tomorrow's sky? Why do you come and try to put such fancies into my head when I'm going home to my darling wife?
Your wife?
She said.
That is different. There is no reason that my terrors should terrify you. I am going to England to rejoin a man whom I was engaged to be married 15 years ago. He was too poor to marry then, and when I was offered a situation as governess in a rich Australian family, I persuaded him to let me accept it, so that I might leave him free and unfettered to win his way in the world, while I saved a little money to help us when we began life together. I never meant to stay away so long, but things have gone badly with him in England. That is my story, and you can understand my fears. They need not influence you. Mine is an exceptional case.
So is mine,
said George impatiently.
I tell you that mine is an exceptional case, although I swear to you that until this moment I have never known a fear as to the result of my voyage home. But you are right, your terrors have nothing to do with me. You have been away 15 years, and all kinds of things may have happened in 15 years. Now it is only 3 years and a half, this very month, since I left England. What could have happened in such a short time as that?
Miss Morley looked at him with a mournful smile, but did not speak. His feverish ardour and freshness and impatience of his nature was so strange and new to her that she looked at him half in admiration, half in pity.
My pretty little wife, my gentle, innocent, loving little wife. Do you know, Miss Morley, he said, with all his hopefulness of manner, that I left my little girl asleep, with a baby in her arms, and with nothing but a few blotted lines to tell her why her faithful husband had deserted her.
Deserted her?
Exclaimed the governess.
Yes, I was a cornet
in a cavalry regiment when I first met my little darling. We were quartered at a stupid seaport town where my pet lived with her shabby old father, a shabby half-pay naval officer, a regular old humbug as poor as Job, and with an eye for nothing but the main chance. I saw through all his shallow tricks to catch one of us for his pretty daughter. I saw all the pitiful, contemptible, palpable traps he set for big dragons to walk into. I saw through his shabby, genteel dinners and public house port, his fine talk of grandeur of his family, and his beard and his bearded old independence, and the sham tears in his bleared old eyes when he talked of his only child. He was a drunken old hypocrite, and he was ready to sell my poor little girl to the highest bidder. Luckily for me, I happened just then into the highest bidder. For my father is a rich man, Miss Morley, and as it was love at first sight on both sides, my darling and I needed a match of it. No sooner, however, did my father hear that I had married a penniless little girl, the daughter of a tipsy old half-pay lieutenant, than he wrote me a furious letter telling me he would never again hold any communication with me and that my yearly allowance would stop from my wedding day. As there was no remaining in such a regiment as mine, with nothing but my pay to live on, and a pretty little wife to keep, I sold out, thinking that before the money that I'd got from my commission was exhausted, I should be sure to drop into something. I took my darling to Italy, and we lived there in splendid style as long as my £2,000 lasted. But when that began to dwindle down to a couple hundred or so, we came back to England, and as my darling had a fancy for being near that tiresome old father of hers, we settled at the watering place where he lived. Well, as the old man heard that I had a couple of £100 left, he expressed a wonderful degree of affection for us and insisted on our boarding in his house. We consented still to please my darling, who had just then a peculiar right to have every whim and fancy of her innocent heart indulged. We did board with him, and finally he fleeced us. But when I spoke of it to my little wife, she only shrugged her shoulders and said she did not like to be unkind to her poor papa. So poor papa made away with our little stock of money in no time, and as I felt that it was now becoming necessary to look about for something, I ran up to London and tried to get a situation as a clerk in a merchant's office, or as an accountant or bookkeeper or something of that kind, but I suppose there was the stamp of a heavy dragoon upon me. For do what I would, I couldn't get anybody to believe in my capacity. And tired out and downhearted, I returned to my darling to find her nursing his son, an heir to his father's poverty. Poor little girl, she was very low-spirited, and when I told her that my London expedition had failed, she fairly broke down and burst into a storm of sobs and lamentations, telling me that I ought not to have married her if I could give her nothing but poverty and misery, and that I had done her a cruel wrong in making her my wife. By heaven, Miss Morley, her tears and her reproaches drove me almost mad, and I flew into a rage with her myself, her father, the world, and everybody in it, and then ran out of the house and declared that I would never enter it again. I walked about the streets all day, half out of my mind, and with a strong inclination to throw myself into the sea so as to leave my poor girl free to make a better match. If I drown myself, her father must support her, I thought.
Hei, Philip. Hun er ikke her nede. Hun er kanskje oppe eller ute. Kan du gå og finne henne? Oh. I'm almost done. You want to sit with me?
No.
Okay. Go up and find Mama?
No.
Do you want to sit with me then?
No.
Well, what are you going to do?
No.
Okay, you can sit right there. Can you be quiet? Okay, thank you. I'm almost done. No, be quiet.
The old hypocrite could never refuse a shelter, but while I live, she has no claim on him. I went down to a rickety old wooden pier, meaning to wait there till it was dark, then dropped quietly over the end of it into the water. But while I sat there smoking my pipe and staring vacantly at the seagulls, two men came down, and one of them began to talk of the Australian gold diggings and the great things that were to be done there. It appeared that he was going to sail in a day or two, and he was trying to persuade his companion to join him in the expedition. I listened to these men for upwards of an hour, following them up and down the pier with my pipe in my mouth and hearing all their talk. After this, I fell in conversation with them myself, and I ascertained that there was a vessel going to leave Liverpool in 3 days, by which vessel one of the men was going out. This man gave me all the information I required, and told me, moreover, that a stalwart young fellow such as I could hardly fail to do well in the diggings, and thought flashed upon me so suddenly that I grew hot and red in the face and trembled in every limb with excitement. This was better than the water at any rate. Suppose I stole away from my darling, leaving her safe under her father's roof, and went and made a fortune in the new world, and came back in a 12-month to throw it into her lap. For I was so sanguine in those days that I counted on making my fortune in a year or so. I thanked the man for his information, and late at night strolled homewards. It was bitter winter weather.
Philip, please stop.
I should probably stop now. I'm so close to the end, though. Oh my gosh.
Philip, 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 please put it down. Please. Stop.
It was bitter winter weather, but I had been too full of passion to feel cold, and I walked through the quiet streets with the snow drifting in my face and a desperate hopefulness in my heart. The old man was sitting drinking brandy and water. All right, I'm going to have to call it because I don't know where Mama is, but Philip is disrupting everything. So I'm going to have to finish it later. See ya. Bye.